Well, the swimmer Leah Thomas is making headlines for being a biological male competing with women in college sports. And we're going to look at this from a Christian and from a biblical and from a pastoral standpoint. Welcome to the Unapologetic Show, where we defend truth without compromise with Dr. Bobby Conway, the One Minute Apologist. I'm your host, Tim Hall. We are here on this channel and in this show, we are helping thinking Christians continue to study and defend their Christian faith. So if that is something that you are interested in, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, liking this video. If you're interested in more resources like this, you can check out the Unapologetic courses that we have. Bobby has 3 courses. I'll leave the link to that on the screen. You can find that at oneminuteapologist.com, and we would invite you to check out some of those courses. And we have over 1,500 videos on our YouTube channel. So this is an excellent place for you to be resourced as a thinking Christian. Now, this is a big topic, Bobby, as we turn to the idea of transgenderism, LGBTQ. Man, there's just lots that we have to cover in this episode. So we'll do our best to kind of get some things out. But one of the things we want to talk about is Florida recently passed a law. It's been, kind of touted as the Don't Say Gay law, but it's largely assumed that that's not really a fair rendering of the law. We have the Human Health Services from the government putting out some new guidelines on transgenderism recently, so that's kind of in the forefront. And we have this kind of ongoing debate with Leah Thomas, as I mentioned in the beginning, and transgender sports. This came up, in 2021 with the Olympics and some of that. So let's just kind of dive in and talk about some of this stuff. And I think it's really important that before we kind of get to any of the transgender things, we really talk about identity, because that's really where this is rooted. Bobby, help us understand, what is identity and where does it come from a Christian lens?
Well, I'm glad that you asked the question by saying from a Christian lens.
Yeah. Because
different people who ascribe to different worldviews will explain identity in different manners.
Yeah.
And so if you don't believe in God, for example, then you're going to need to figure out where you derive your identity from. Yeah. Some people derive their identity from what others say about them, and then they end up going through life racked with insecurities. Others become self-made people, so to speak, and they figure out the kind of identity that they think that they want to project, and so they start living that way. But as Christians, our identity is not in what others say about us, and our identity is not in what we think we want it to be. Yep. Our identity is the fact that we are created by God, and He's the one who wired us. Many people in our culture have reduced their identity to their sexual preferences. What we're going to say as Christians, you have a much bigger identity than what the culture has on offer. An identity that's not reduced simply to your sexual preferences. We're talking to people, the reason they feel so threatened if you don't agree with them on their sexual preferences or going through a sex change or any of that stuff, it's because they feel like that you are rejecting their identity. But you're not rejecting their identity from a Christian worldview. You're rejecting their identity from a current worldview, and from the way in which the world has reductionistically made our identity equivalent to our sexual desires. And think about that. Yeah. So if that's what you really believe, if you believe my identity is my sexual desires, then that's the most important thing about you. Yeah. And that's what people need to accept about you. And this is why we parade it. And we think that's the most important thing, it seems like, by the way we talk, is who people can be with or not be with, or how we can dress. And it's like we're obsessed with our intimacy lives.
Right. Yeah, identity is, from what you're describing, seems more of like a top-down. It's a God down to us kind of thing, and not necessarily a bottom-up. It's not us observing our surroundings and trying to, pick one of those niches, those societal niches, and then shove ourselves into that based on our actions or whatever. So, so I think with that, that's really interesting. As you were talking, one of the things that kept coming to mind is that we want to, as we're having this discussion on this show, and this is mainly for our listeners, we want to make sure that we differentiate between, kind of a biological, theological, sociological, or political perspective and a pastoral perspective. So if we're kind of just talking about, hard facts on the ground, whether that's biological facts or sociological facts or like what's going on, political, or we're talking about an interpretation of a text in Scripture, that's something different than what you might be talking about or how you navigate a conversation that's, someone that's in the LGBTQ community across the table over a cup of coffee. So I think that's a good lens to kind of view. We need to be careful as we filter through some of this stuff that we're going to be talking about some kind of just hard facts and figures and interpretations of Scripture, and that's what we believe to be the case. And there's other things that we're going to say. If you're having a conversation with somebody, you might want to frame it a little bit different. You might want to come at it from a different perspective. And I think one of those things that, again, if we're talking about just kind of these baseline facts, is what is gender and how then does it relate to sex? That seems to be a lot of conflict going on. There's a language component. There's this sociological component. So, Bobby, how would you answer that question? What is gender and how does it relate to sex?
Gender is ascribed, to us by God, is what I would say biblically, right? God gives us a gender, and we are born with a gender, and so how does that relate to sex then? If you're born a male, or if you're born a female, it means that if you're born a male, you have male organs, and if you're born a female, you have female reproductive organs.
Right.
And God has aligned these two to fit together for His procreative purposes, for the enjoyment in the context of a marriage. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not confusion that people will struggle with. So not only that, when it comes to the fact that there's the human race, within the human race, God made them male and female. Anything you'd add?
Well, yeah, and I think, again, some of this gender now, again, so like 21st century in our current culture, gender is kind of like how you relate to other people socially. It would be considered what's a social construct, right? It's how you fit stereotypical norms. Like those who tend to wear dresses are female, they're gendered female. And that doesn't necessarily say much about, what's under the dress, if you will, or what's going on inside, or what their, chromosomal makeup is. So I think that's a little bit different, but that raises this other interesting perspective of how do I know that I am a man, and how do you know that you're a man? Because I can only experience myself. I can only experience what I experience. And so what that then becomes is it becomes a lot of external stereotypes that you're fitting into. So when someone says, I identify as a female, we have to ask the question, well, does that mean that you're identifying with certain feminine stereotypes in your current culture? Or is there something kind of like ontologically happening on the inside that you are something else? And I would say, I don't know how you could know that, right? So what would you?
Well, I mean, it's true. There's such a thing as gender dysphoria, where there is a lot of confusion that people have. And I can't imagine what that would be like.
Right.
I mean, just try to think about that for a moment, Tim, like how conflicted you would feel if to look in the mirror and see man, but then feel like you're a woman.
Right.
That's got to be a heavy duty trial. And the culture doesn't help because they've made this cool almost, right? So it's like it's constantly marketed, it's sung about, it's in film, it's all over the place, and many people don't even realize it's happening. They become a product of the culture. They don't even see what's taking place, but there are. It's true scientifically. I mean, you can go through a sex change, but that doesn't change your gender.
Right.
Because, it's XX or it's XY, the chromosomes, right? You're male or you're female. Now, you can change your appearance to look a little bit more like the sex that you aspire to. But nevertheless, it doesn't change your essential ontological self, as you talked about. So you have this feeling issue then that you're left with. And so what's going to drive the conclusion? Is it going to be follow the facts and science, XX or XY? Or now, do we not want to follow the science, and do we want to follow feelings? Well, because we so value sexuality in our culture, and we have made our identities reducible to our sexual preferences and our sexual desires and our sexual choices, what ends up happening is because our identity of sexuality has become our ultimate, it's now become our idol, and that idol trumps all scientific thought.
Right.
What holds is just go with our feelings. And it's like the emperor's new clothes. It's like we just let the emperor walk naked, and we celebrate and we clap. But we all know the absurdity of it. Like nobody is actually a female just because they feel it, any more than like if I said I feel like I'm African American.
Right.
I mean, it's just absurd. And you know what? It would be more consistent, it would seem like, to say I'm an African American male than to say that I'm a Caucasian female.
Right.
Because there's some correspondence, right? Now, I guess there's correspondence in both, but from the fact that, you're Caucasian, I'm using a Caucasian for Caucasian and a male for male.
Right.
But my point is, I think men will align more with men when it comes to their anatomy than a man would with a female.
Right.
So I don't think we need to be saying things like, oh, well, I'm an African American, or but I think these points come out to say you just can't go around saying these things. I mean, listen, I kid you not, Tim. We had dinner this past week with our dear friends, my buddy who led us to the Lord.
Okay.
And we were hanging out with his kids, and his daughter was talking about how they have kids that are dressing up as cats, and they wear cat ears, and they wear a cat leash, and then there's somebody who pulls the person on the leash, and the person meows because that person identifies as a cat. And we're allowing this stuff to happen. And there's people like, oh, that's great. Way to come into your feline, identity here.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, just because you think you're a cat doesn't make you a cat.
Right.
And so what's going to happen is we have to just call a spade a spade. We have to quit feeling like we have to cower down to like this. Listen, I feel bad. I really do. If somebody's feeling emotionally like they're the opposite sex. Yeah. But we can't change the name of science altogether. We have to look at this and treat, well, what's going on? What's influencing this? And I think a lot of music, a lot of entertainment, a lot of science, a lot of media, or not a lot of science, excuse me, a lot of media is pushing this. No science is coming out and saying you're actually,
I do want to ask you about a few Bible passages that do address, gender identity and kind of some of these topics that we could turn to help give an understanding. But before we do that, I just wanted to, kind of mention a few things. There's been Matt Walsh, who's a conservative pundit who, was on the Dr. Phil show and with, two transgender person, and he asked them, what is a woman? And
it's like, what is a woman?
Well,
can you tell me what a woman is?
No, I can't.
And neither of them really could give an answer. Recently, there was a Supreme Court justice that was up for nomination, and one of the people that were on the Judiciary Committee asked her, what is a woman? And, she kind of said, I'm not a biologist, I can't really answer this. Yeah. So, and even you mentioned this, when the idea of woman, there's several different markers that you could use in order to be able to define that. And several of them kind of fall into that heading of biology. Your chromosomes are going to, give a pretty clear indication if they're XX or XY. Your, outward, what's under your pants,
genitalia,
are going to give you a pretty clear indication of what's going on. There are some, stereotypes that are going to give you a pretty clear indication, but those are all assuming that when they're working properly, and then we do leave room for kind of the anomalies. We know that there's anomalies just in birth. If someone is born without arms, like our friend Daniel Ritchie, we wouldn't say, oh, well, that's normal. So, armness is a spectrum, right?
Yeah, there is an intersex condition,
right? Yeah,
that is so rare,
right?
That in that particular situation, if somebody has both anatomical male and female parts in that situation, then, in a situation like that, you can be sympathetic of going, oh, well, I mean, you make your decision here. I guess if they did the chromosomal study, there would be those that would be ultra strong on just saying, go with what the chromosome shows.
Yeah.
Others might say, go with what your feelings shows. Almost if you're going to be consistent, though, it makes sense to go with the chromosome in spite of the feelings, because then you leave yourself a door open to saying, see, you're being inconsistent.
Right. Let's talk a little bit first about just kind of some passages that you would turn to, and then let's kind of get to the nub of the conversation about, sports and who should be competing in different sports, as we started off with Leah Thomas. So what passages in the Bible would you turn to help inform us in this area?
Well, I think the big one, as I would just say, go to the book of Genesis.
Okay.
Right in the very beginning, in Genesis 1:26 and 27, that God created us as male and female in his image. And so by creating us in his image and creating us male and female, we have an identity that is built by God, and we are to reflect something of God in the way that we live. And there's something beautiful about a male and a female together, and I'm not even speaking simply as marriage, just male and female part of humanity, that together we can reflect in a redeemed state so much more of what God has to show us about himself than we can on our own.
Yeah. Again, I would add, and basically I'm just building on yours, but Jesus, refers back to that creation narrative in Matthew 19. And so he's just, again, reaffirming that. So
he is, absolutely.
He's just reaffirming that. So that's good. So let's talk a little bit about, where should Christians stand? Again, this is kind of a difficult conversation when it comes to biological males and biological females participating in the sports of the opposite sex. I hope I said that correctly. I was watching a debate with somebody that is, she was a transgender male. So she was born a female and now lives as a man. But one of the things that, he was saying was that it's a costume that essentially he puts on.
I'm not trying to be cruel. You're wearing a costume. Is that?
That's right. That's right. Now, some trans people will be very offended by that.
But in that sense, I think that was a really honest comment that this person was making about that it was a costume that they were putting on. And so if that's the case, and again, we could talk about whether or not that is the case. Is it right for them to participate in the sport of the opposite sex, if you will? What are your thoughts on that?
Before I answer that, when you're talking about like putting on a costume, I think one thing that Christians have to come to terms with is this question. We have to know how to answer this. Is there a place where sexuality crosses boundaries? Because I think that we're living in such dark times that you watch TV and you got to wonder, is there anything that's taboo?
Right.
Is it just whatever you feel like doing? Carte blanche. I think that one thing that we have to come to terms with is, do we actually believe you can even cross lines when it relates to what we feel like doing sexually?
Yeah.
I think you can.
Yeah, I definitely.
And I think that for me, the sex has a context.
Yeah.
It's called marriage between a man and a woman. Now, if people, slip up throughout their life, that doesn't mean that God's not forgiving.
Right.
But it does mean that we've fallen short of his ideal. I was very promiscuous with the women before I became a Christian.
Yeah.
I know what that was like to. And I'm not trying to condone that. I think it caused my brain a lot of problems. It caused me lots of consequences. I wasn't a self-controlled man. I objectified women. I mean, it did not help my character. But I think the way that we present things is true character is just embracing the sexual revolution and just going with whatever your feelings feel like. No, that'll destroy your character.
Right.
You won't have self-control. You might pick up STDs. You'll have a hard time being a faithful spouse. You'll use people. But this is the values that are being presented to us, and we have to see through it. Now, to your question, I think it's absurd that this person, Leah Thomas, which I don't believe is a female.
Right.
I think it is somebody who is masquerading as a female and getting in the pool with females and has simply stripped the award away from the #1 female swimmer.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a shame.
Yeah.
My heart hurts for somebody like Leah Thomas, and I'm using that name because I don't know what his actual name is.
Right.
But I would say it's sad to me that there's that kind of confusion, but I also think there's a selfishness that somebody, like I'm sitting thinking, if I wanted to be a female when I was younger as a baseball player, man, and I think about how I could throw a baseball.
Yeah.
And if I was going to go out on a softball team, dude, I mean, this is not a sexist thing. It's just the fact that men are stronger.
Yeah.
Like men don't have reproductive systems. Like
Right.
there's
On average,
differences,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
This is stuff where people we're offending people by saying that men are actually physically stronger.
Yeah.
And that women have reproductive systems. We need to get past the ludicrousy of like having to apologize. This doesn't mean men are better or women are better because they have reproductive systems. It just means we are different.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be really selfish of me to jump into a baseball game as a female and play on a female team, play on a female baseball team and start pitching.
Right.
When I was younger, at my peak.
Yeah.
That's absurd, and I think it disturbs me that he can get in the pool in the name of she and take away so many awards and change the game of sports and change the way we use our vocabulary.
Right.
And we are about to change all of our vocabulary and we're going to see an unfairness, an inequality. And so shockingly, this is all built on fairness, so to speak. Well, what about the fairness in the sports? I don't think it's fair at all.
Yeah.
And I think some people, we so swallowed the juice of this
age.
cultural elixir that I feel like some people think, man, this just seems so insensitive. And I go, I think that we've got to wake up and get our head out of the sand and see what's really happening here.
Yeah. Speaking of waking up, and we'll do a little bit of a transition here. Speaking of waking up, recently Disney, some insider information from Disney came out about how they're trying to increase the LGBTQIA, characters and the minority characters up to 50%. So these are some things that it's good for Christians to know and be thinking through and understanding where the Bible is coming from, how we need to think about this biblically. But I will say specifically on the sports issue, I think that if we're honest, we can acknowledge that there may be, when you're drawing hard lines, there may be people that fall outside of those lines that still should be within those lines. Let me explain what I mean by that. Even the Olympic Committee right now is when they're setting up certain tests on who can perform in a male or female side. There are people that were born female that have female genitalia, that have the specific chromosomes of a female, but then their testosterone might be a little bit raised, and so they don't quite fit all of those parts per million when they're doing the testing, and so they're kind of a little bit outside of that. And then you have to say, okay, well then are they not allowed to perform with females? And those are difficult and hard questions. But if all the markers are kind of lining up, except for one erratic one here and one erratic one maybe there, I think it's pretty clear that you kind of go with the average of what's going on. So we know someone like Leah Thomas does not fit those markers. They went through male puberty. They do have a longer arm span. They haven't been on testosterone blockers for long enough to make a difference in competition. So I think those are some really clear things that we need to be thinking about.
And you take Bruce Jenner, who's Caitlyn,
right,
who has been through this,
yeah,
and was Olympic champion,
right,
he'd say, there's no way that Leah Thomas should be in the water.
Yeah.
It's not a fair advantage. And so I'm going, this is somebody who would know.
Right, so they know. So any final closing thoughts here in our last few seconds?
Nope, thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah, this is a very wide and broad subject. We tried to cover it as best we could. If anything that we forgot, please leave it in the comments, and we'll meet you next time on The Unapologetic Show.